Hello and welcome to another edition of the Ask Dr. Pickel show, where we try to find answers for people who have chronic conditions, chronic health issues, autoimmune conditions. If you haven't been with us before, I'm Dr. Jason Pickel. I practice functional medicine. I'm a board certified chiropractic neurologist, and we see many patients who have some pretty bad health problems. And so today's topic, kind of interesting stuff, low energy. And we see low energy a lot. I'd say 99% of our patients, one of their top complaints is low energy or fatigue, tired all the time. Why is this occurring? Is there just one thing that causes this? Not usually. But are there many potential problems? Yes, absolutely. And so today we want to go over one of those potential problems. And it's one of them that I see very often. And it's one that maybe isn't talked about as much or seen as much. And there's many reasons for this to occur. But energy is pretty important. Everything in your body, in order for it to work, has to have energy. I mean, what is energy? Energy is basically, in the human body, think of it as fuel. So in our car, we have to put gas in it or it doesn't go anywhere. It won't even start without any fuel or gas. So in the human body, there's really two types of fuel in order to make this energy. And those two types of fuel, and hopefully you guys know this from watching our past videos, blood sugar and oxygen. So those are the two main types of fuel in the human body. We got to have them both. So important for both of them to be correct. And if they're not, there's usually reasons why. So today we're going to talk more about the oxygen side. When we think of oxygen, we think, oh, I got plenty of oxygen. I can just breathe the air outside. Now, maybe if you're breathing through a mask, you might be getting less oxygen, but that's not our topic really for today. As far as it's not the reason that we're talking about today. So, when it comes to oxygen, the first thing we do is we do breathe it in, but then where does it go from there? Yeah, it goes to our lungs. Then what happens? So then it goes into our bloodstream. And then when it gets in our bloodstream, it has to eventually make its way to our cells. And then our cells intake those oxygen molecules and use them to actually make what's called ATP. It's our body's energy. At a cellular level, all of our cells have to have oxygen. If they don't, bad things happen. So, and low energy, again, is one of the main symptoms, but also many other symptoms can occur when we're not getting oxygen. Now, the thing is, when we think of oxygen, first we've got to think of delivery. How does oxygen get to your cells, which we just kind of talked about? It's in circulation. Our heart pumps, and that drives that blood through our bloodstream, through circulation, and eventually that oxygen, which is inside of what are called red blood cells, eventually that gets to our cells and drops off some oxygen, the oxygen delivery guys, I guess you could say, and then we, of course, are able to keep going each day. So how can we tell if someone's maybe having problems, and then what types of problems can occur? So first of all, when you go into your doctor's office, sometimes they'll check some different things. One thing they'll check is your blood pressure. Your blood pressure is going to tell us, hey, is there enough pressure in those arteries that blood is pushing out at a certain pressure there? Now, and I'm not as worried about high blood pressure. I mean, yes, high blood pressure is a problem, but not when it comes to this. High blood pressure, you're getting plenty of pressure, too much actually. This would be more a scenario if you have low blood pressure. If you have low blood pressure, you're not getting that blood to your cells as well, and you're not turning over your red blood cells as much and getting the oxygenation to your cells. So low blood pressure is going to be a problem. And another thing that can be checked too is they'll put a little thing on your finger and it kind of pinches there a little bit and it's got a little red light in it. And this is called a pulse oximeter. So one thing that it's going to do is it's going to look at your oxygen saturation. And where we would like to see that is like 98 to 100. 98% to 100%. We normally should see 98 to 100% saturation. That means there's lots of oxygen in your bloodstream, in your red blood cells. Your red blood cells are lit up with it. If you start to get down below a 98, 97, 96, you're starting to maybe get a little less there. When you get down 96, 95, 94, that's way too low. You are not getting oxygen to your cells. So these are a couple of tests that can kind of give us some generalities if you're getting oxygen to your cells. And think of not only our cells as just the organs, the systems, the muscles in our body, but also our brain. So if you decrease oxygen to these areas down here, that can cause malfunction there. You can start to see some symptoms. But if you decrease oxygen to the brain, what do you start to notice? Hey, signs of low fuel, mental fatigue, foggy headed, again, quite a few different symptoms there, not just fatigue, as in, hey, I'm tired, but, I'm trying to read this book and I'm going to fall asleep. So, again, these are some general things that can be looked at. So, what can typically, what is another thing that can come into play here, besides just looking at your vitals? A big one, and this is probably the major thing here that we see so often here in the office, and these are called anemias. All right, and you've probably heard of the word anemia, and we're going to kind of describe some different types of anemias that can occur that you may not know are going on. In fact, many times people will go to their doctor's office and they'll do a blood test and they mainly check one marker for anemia. And not even, and again, they're really only going to do anything about it or consider it if it gets below those wide ranges, which usually by the time it gets out of range, it's already gone quite a ways. It's already become a major, major problem. So we want to kind of figure that out early, and we're going to talk about some ways that will look for that too. So when we talk about anemias, let's kind of pull this up here. All right. So let's put it at our top here. Energy. All right. So anemia. And when we talk about anemia, again, this means we have less oxygen ability or less oxygen carrying ability in our cell. So there's different types of anemias. There's quite a few different ones, but we're going to talk about the most common ones and the ones that really we see very, very often, that often get undiagnosed, and people are just left to, hey, I feel lousy every day, but my doctor said I'm fine. So I'm going to do a bunch of stimulants, or I'm going to take a medication that they prescribed to try to up my energy to get me through my day. So if we're looking at anemias, one of the common ones you always hear about is iron deficiency. So iron deficiency, extremely common type of anemia. Iron is used in your cells to make what's called hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is what attaches to those oxygen molecules and kind of holds on to them while you're taxiing that oxygen around your system and your bloodstream with your red blood cells. So those red blood cells, think of them as taxi cabs for oxygen, and other things too, but definitely oxygen, big important part. So iron deficiency, if you're low in iron, yes, now you can't carry as much oxygen to your cells. Now we're going to have a problem, and you're going to start to suffer symptoms of that. Low energy is probably the biggest one. All right. Now, what's another kind of anemia that you rarely hear about, doctors rarely talk about? Usually when you hear anemia, it's almost always iron that's talked about. if you say, hey, I'm anemic, then most people are going to think iron. But there's absolutely other types of anemias that can occur and are pretty darn common and are often either misdiagnosed or not diagnosed. So, and these kind of all run really with B vitamins. So we can have a B12 anemia, we can have a folate anemia, or we can have a B6 anemia. Now, sometimes a B12 anemia, they might call it a pernicious anemia. So, but again, B12, pretty important. And a lot of these B vitamins, they operate in the manufacturing of red blood cells. So pretty important that these levels are good. So folate, again, now with folate, sometimes your doctors will say folic acid, or they might give you a supplement with folic acid, or you might be taking a prenatal that says folic acid, and definitely know the difference. What is folic acid and what is folate? And what's the difference? Well, the difference is folic acid is synthetic folate. But it's the term that's used by the FDA when you do labeling. So the problem is some of your supplements might say folic acid on them. Now, if they just say folic acid, it's kind of junk. Folic acid doesn't absorb well. It doesn't utilize well in the body. When you're pregnant, you need a good source of folate. That's to prevent birth defects. So the thing is you need folate. Now, sometimes it'll say folic acid, and then in parentheses, it'll say as folate or as MTHF, which means methyl tetrahydrofolate. So again, folate, pretty important, and not folic acid. Look at it that way. Also B6, and B6 will often come in the form as P5P, which is kind of the preferable activated form. We're going to talk more about these in a second. But the first thing is when we see these two types here, why? The first question we have to ask is, why are they deficient? Your doctor could say, hey, you're iron deficient, but you got to ask why. If I'm losing iron, if I'm anemic, it doesn't just happen for no reason. There's not just some people that are anemic and some people that are not. There's a reason. If you are losing blood, if you have a heavy menstrual period or you have internal bleeding, yeah, those could be reasons, and which will usually show up as blood in your stool. Those are usually reasons where you can get anemias, but those aren't the most common. I mean, the heavy menstrual period is extremely common. So, but again, even with that, you got to ask, why is it heavy, and why am I not having a normal, regular period like many people are that's not extreme heavy? Now, the other thing we've got to ask is if those two things aren't going on, or even if it's heavy for one day and, which can be a kind of what some people classify as heavy may not be heavy to another person when we talk about menstrual periods. But let's kind of not get into that subject as much as let's get into what's another reason these things can be deficient. The iron, the B vitamins, or really any other vitamins and minerals. It's because you're not absorbing things. So if you have gut inflammation, or let's even call that leaky gut, that's probably the term you'll hear often. If you have low hydrochloric acid, low HCl, your stomach makes acid. It's a good acid. We need it. That's what breaks down our foods. That's what helps break down minerals. That's what activates the enzymes, our digestive enzymes. That's what activates our gallbladder to release bile. We need hydrochloric acid production, extremely important. But again, if you're not making enough acid, you're not going to break down these minerals. They can't absorb. They can't digest and absorb. If your gut's inflamed or swollen, these bigger molecules, these minerals, these vitamins, they're not going to absorb very well. So, I have many patients who take not only supplements, but let's put it this way. I have many new patients who will come in with large bags of supplements and they'll say, Dr. Pickel, I take all of this and I don't understand, I've been doing this for years and I, and this doctor told me this doctor told me take this. Well, the problem that they're having many times is they're not absorbing these things. they're taking some great stuff, but it's ending up in the toilet. So this is an important aspect that has to be recognized, because when we see these deficiencies, it's usually an absorption issue. Now, there are other issues where, like with B12 or a pernicious anemia, this means you may have another issue in your stomach where what's called intrinsic factor isn't working. You can actually have an autoimmune condition which affects your ability to absorb B12. And that goes on commonly with Hashimoto's thyroiditis. In fact, it's kind of goes hand in hand with Hashimoto's. So now another factor too that can come into play with B12 is you may have a genetic issue called MTRR, which means you don't utilize B12 as well. So you may need a different form of B12. There's different forms of B12, and you may need the activated type forms. Also, same thing with folate. You could have the MTHFR type gene. MTHFR, kind of the popular gene. And if this is a problem, you won't utilize folate. So if the bottle just says folate, you might take it. It can end up in the toilet. You may need the activated form, which is called methylated folate. So, and then B6, again, kind of similar thing. We may need the activated form, P5P. These are going to absorb and utilize in your bloodstream better. But again, it still comes down to absorption. You need to be able to absorb this stuff for it to actually work. So absorption issues are at the top of the list as far as a cause of an anemia, especially if it's an iron anemia or a B12 anemia. Now, another thing that comes into play here too is if we have an iron anemia, the cells get smaller. Okay, here's our red blood cells. Now, actually, red blood cells look a little different than this. They aren't perfectly round. But so if we have this small one, that's called a microcytic anemia. So this is when we're iron deficient. That means the cell gets smaller. I'm throwing these technical terms out for a reason because we're going to talk about something here in a minute. And you don't have to remember them, though. So just remember, the cell gets smaller with iron deficiency. So here would be our normal. And then here's our larger, where the red blood cell gets bigger. And this is called a macrocytic anemia, where the red blood cell is larger. Now, we're going to put that into play here in a minute because we want to talk about how this can be looked at and how we can figure out if you have these issues. But first, there's a few other potentials for anemia that we see commonly too. Especially with autoimmune conditions. So oftentimes we'll see bone marrow suppression. And you'll rarely hear any doctors talk about this. They'll only talk about bone marrow when you have a bone marrow disease. But bone marrow suppression, our bone marrow, this is where all of our blood cells are manufactured and made. This is the factory that makes our red blood cells, our white blood cells. Then they go to other organs to mature, such as our spleen and our thymus. And then they turn into other cells too. So, but bone marrow suppression, what could be suppressing my bone marrow or its ability to function? What can affect the factory? Well, one of those main things can be inflammatory cytokines. What the heck is that, Dr. Pickel? So inflammatory inflammation, cytokines, these are cellular messengers. There's lots of cytokines in the body. There's lots of little messengers in our body that float around, and we need these guys, but there's some of them that are inflammatory. And if you have a chronic health condition, and especially an autoimmune condition, your inflammatory cytokines are high most of the time, elevated most of the time. And if they are elevated, they can create other problems in the body. And one of the problems that they can cause is they can suppress your bone marrow's ability to manufacture blood cells. So then white blood cell counts can drop, red blood cell counts can drop. And another thing that can suppress the bone marrow production is forgot the V in heavy, metal toxicity. So if you have heavy metal toxicity in your system, which many people do, again, you can't see it on a blood test because these don't float around in the bloodstream. They live in the cells, but you can't really biopsy and use electron microscopes on all the cells in your body to find out where they are. So again, there's other ways that we use to figure out, if heavy metal toxicity is there. I'm not going to get into that, but heavy metal toxicity definitely is another thing that can suppress bone marrow function. So very important. And heavy metal toxicity rampant in autoimmune conditions. It just compromises your overall immune system. So again, these are very common causes. Now, there's also another thing that can fit into this too, which is actually what's called erythropoietin production. And if that is decreased. So erythropoietin, this is made in your bone marrows, it's made in your kidneys, and this also goes into the manufacturing of these red blood cells. So pretty darn important. And so if you have issues with your kidneys, issues with your bone marrow, then this is going to cause a drop. And it's very common that people have issues with their kidneys, especially if they have long-standing health issues. We'll find you can easily see on a blood test the kidneys are compromised. So this can affect erythropoietin production. All right. So then we've got to say, okay, how can we find out if you have an issue like this? I mean, is it on your typical blood test? Well, it should be. Really, you should just have to run a CBC, which is a complete blood count. Some doctors run these often, some doctors don't. And there's a few other elements that we need to look at too. But just with that complete blood count, we're going to see your red blood cells. We're going to see, well, and we'll also see your white blood cells too, but we're not talking about those right now. And then we're going to see your hemoglobin, just HGB hemoglobin. Another thing called hematocrit. And again, I'm just writing kind of the lab symbols for these. Then we're going to see your mean corpuscular volume, MCH, MCHC. We're going to see some values here, and I won't explain what all those mean. But the thing that you need to know is if you've had some blood done recently, I'm giving you some tips right now where you can figure out on your own. And again, this should be recent blood because blood changes a lot. Levels of B vitamins, iron changes a lot. If you've had some recent blood work, first you're going to look for, hey, are my red blood cells low? Because then we have a problem. Now, they don't have to be low. They can be low or normal. We're not talking about white blood cells right now. Now, here's the thing that most of your doctors are going to just look at. They're just going to look at your hemoglobin. And if it's fine, they're going to say, no, you don't have an anemia. You're fine. Absolutely no problem at all. Not true. The hemoglobin can still look normal and you can have an anemia. So the thing we're going to look at is that hemoglobin low or normal. And really with a lot of these, they could potentially look normal and you may not know it because they actually can kind of skew each other. Let's say you had both a B12, a folate, and an iron anemia. Let's say you had all three. That's going to they're actually going to kind of mask each other. Because remember a minute ago when we talked about how the red blood cell can get larger or smaller? Well, when you have the B12 type anemias, let's do this. When you have the B12 type anemias, that will make all of this larger. That will make all of these numbers go up. So if you have a B12, folate, or B6, all of these numbers are going to get larger. They're going to go above the range. That's going to be B12, folate, B6. Now, if they go smaller, if this number goes down, that's more of what we call a microcytic anemia. These numbers are going to drop smaller. So then we know it's potentially iron. But again, let's say we have both B12 and iron deficiencies. Well, they're supposed to be getting larger with B12, smaller with iron. That might make it look normal. It could trick you. So then you've got to look at some other things. So one thing you can look at is you can check your actual iron level of your blood. And you want to see if it's low. There you go. Hey, that's the amount floating in your bloodstream. Now that can fluctuate sometime and it doesn't always mean you're iron deficient. The more important marker that has to be looked at is called ferritin. And remember this one because this one's pretty important and your doctor should be running this, especially if you have a potential for anemia. Your ferritin is the stored iron in your body. Now the iron can store in multiple areas in your body, but one of the main areas, our biggest warehouse, let's put it, is our liver. Our liver contains tons of iron, or it should. And again, we want to see that in range. Now, here's the problem. The range conventionally at most labs is very wide. In fact, probably the more recent one I've seen on blood tests here in the last few months is down to about 13 on a ferritin. So this is a problem because when you get down below a 13, actually 13 is already too low. But again, they're looking for pathologic iron deficiency. I mean, it gets to an extreme before you do something about it with conventional medicine. Let's be proactive. Let's look at it when it gets below, let's say, less than 50. In the research papers that we've seen, if you get less than 50, you can be considered anemic. We don't want your warehouse, your storage to drop lower than that. So I always like to see that above a 50. All right, or at least a 50. So, okay, so we can look at these two things here. Another thing you can look at is like an early warning light. It's called TIBC, total iron binding capacity. And again, if this number goes high, that's a problem. If this number goes high, that's like a little early warning light saying, hey, anemia is here or it's coming down the pipe. So this is another thing we can look at. I mean, there's other markers you can look at too called iron saturation. There's even a few other things. So, but the thing is really, I would say the biggest markers here are iron, ferritin, and then looking at these guys here and seeing where they're at. Because usually if they drop low enough, because the thing is if your hemoglobin's low, red blood cells are low, this could be due again to the B vitamin deficiencies, B12, folate, B6, or it could be due to the iron deficiencies. And it's finding out which type this is. All right, and then even further than that, how would we know more about B12 or folate status or B6 status? Well, you can also look at those on a blood test too. Now, if you test B12, and this is important because if your doctor says, hey, let's check your B12 level, and the blood comes back with a test that says B12 on it, no, don't believe it. It could be up in the thousands, and the doctor says, oh, you got plenty of B12, no problem at all. Don't believe a B12. A straight B12 test. B12 fluctuates in the bloodstream moment to moment. So the important test that you'll want to request is called an MMA. And that's not mixed martial arts. That's methylmalonic acid. All right. Okay, so methylmalonic acid. This can be done by blood or urine, and this is going to give you more of an accurate status of your B12 levels. Also, so folate, yeah, you can just check blood folate. Now, again, this can be rough because if you have an MTHFR issue, if you have a genetic issue with folate, you could have tons of folate floating around in your bloodstream, but if you can't activate it and utilize it, it's actually creating problems and it'll just end up in the toilet. So again, folate status, if you have a genetic issue like MTHFR, you can't really look at it just as that. And that's a very common gene that people have a problem with. All right, and then same thing, you can also measure B6 levels in the body, but how do you know it's getting activated? How do you know it's getting into your cells? So these can be tough ones. So there are ways we can figure this out, but it goes a lot deeper than that. But this will at least give you some general information on some things to do, what's your status on these things, because again, if these things are off, if this isn't working, we get decreased oxygen. You get decreased oxygen, that's decreased fuel, and wait a second here. And now the body cannot function. So, or properly. You know, in fact, I just had a patient recently, this was this maybe 2 weeks ago. She's pregnant. She's like, I'm tired all the time. The fatigue suddenly occurred. She was doing pretty good. I think she's probably about in her second trimester. maybe towards the end of second trimester. And energy levels plummeted, nothing there, just tired all the time. First thing we were thinking, hey, is your blood sugar, how's your blood sugar doing? She's eating, we know that's good. And then we checked, actually her other doctor had ran her blood test. Of course, all they checked was hemoglobin. Her hemoglobin was just kind of towards the bottom of the range. It actually was kind of almost looking normal. The doctor said, you might have a little anemia. Well, we said, hey, let's check this further. So we ran the ferritin and the serum iron test. Ferritin was like at a 7. There's no iron left in her system. Started giving her iron right away. Again, there's types of iron you want to take too. There's better forms than others. We won't get into that. But started giving her iron, everything changed. Energy levels, mood, I mean, it's just night and day. So again, it's kind of just figuring out what is going on and what can be done about it. All right, couple of things here. Hi, Courtney. All right. First one who told me that, yeah, great. I'm glad you've got some good information here. And, you know, you can take so many supplements, but they have to absorb. Very, very crucial. And microcytic anemia, as it is, it's you know, usually an iron issue. Now, there's other types of microcytic anemias too, but if it's linked to bone marrow, it usually is heavy metals or again, the overall inflammatory load in your system. So hopefully that helped out. Thank you for the great comments and questions there. All right, I hope everybody got some great stuff, great information today. Let's get rid of this and switch over here. All right, guys, so do share us on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. Give us the thumbs up, the little hearts, all the stuff. We love it, and we want to get this information out to others, so we really appreciate that. God bless. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time.